Hello and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 22 and I'm going to read the presentation that I made at the American Maritain Association just a few days ago. And it was called, I don't recall what it was called actually. What did I name it? Well, oh well. So I'm gonna present that to you, and then yeah, it was received pretty well, so I'm pretty happy about it. I have another presentation in early May, which is more on this one was focused on distinguishing the mutuum loan from exchanges more generally. And the one in May that I'm going to do at the International Conference of Medieval Studies, that one is going to be showing the connection in Aquinas' thought on usury with respect to Roman law and how he synthesizes Roman law and Aristotle in such a way that it's actually a much stronger argument than if you read it purely from a Aristotelian perspective. And then my thesis director suggested that I submit a proposal for a conference in Paris, and that conference is it's oddly named, and I don't have the handout thing ready at hand, but it was like basically it's Aquinas on economics, and so I'm probably going to do something along the lines of how Aquinas understands different contracts insofar as profit can be licitly taken, because he identifies a few different contracts where profit is taken. Contracts here might be a little too restrictive, because I want to also talk about trading, which is really two contracts. It's one moral act, but it's two contracts. And so trading, leases, and partnerships. And I'm really going to argue that the places he recognizes illicit profit are places where value is added to the economy. And I'm going to juxtapose that to the mutuum, where value is not added to the economy, and kind of work that out, because there is a little bit of confusion, I think, in the way that's parsed out in the way that economists will talk about it. But we'll see. I haven't written it yet. I've written up the proposal, and so I have, if it gets accepted, the conference is in September, so I have several months to kind of work that out. But today is going to be my AMA presentation, and I'm going to post this on my my Substack and my Academia profile, and so you can read it in either of those places. So without further ado, we're already 5 minutes in, and let's go ahead and get into it. So the Summa Theologiae is sometimes compared to a grand cathedral with different treatises representing different parts of this grand structure. However, if we turn to those questions on voluntary commutations, so exchanges and loans, This part of the cathedral appears to be in somewhat of disrepair. Indeed, entering into this side chapel dedicated to the question on usury, the topic of this presentation, we may find a mere heap of rubble. I think it's hardly controversial to claim that usury is an area of significant confusion and broad disagreement. Scholarly opinions extend from usury is not present or relevant today to usury is everywhere, and capitalism is largely, if not wholly, dependent upon usurious dealings. However, much of this discussion proceeds from mistaken premises. Therefore, in order to proceed to the focus of this presentation, usury and the nature of contracts, I must first clear away some of the rubble to begin building on a firm foundation. Now, the most common error I've encountered in understanding usury is the view that usury is inexorably tied up with the nature or sterility of money. I've spoken about this in my prior essay with the AMA, but let me briefly recapitulate the central argument from Aquinas, which can be found in the De Malo question 13, article 4, response to the 15th objection. And it goes thus: every good has multiple uses, as shoes may be worn or sold. Now, some uses consume or alienate the good, that is, the possessor loses possession of them. So when you eat a sandwich, it literally goes away. But also when you sell your shoes, it's no longer a part of you. It's no longer a part of what is yours. Now, when the good is granted to be used in this way, in a loan, exacting more than the return of the same is illicit and usury. However, other uses of the same good do not consume it. When the good is granted for this use, one may licitly charge something more for the use. For example, a pair of shoes may be granted to be worn, and so since this does not consume them, they may be rented for a profit. You could imagine something like a pair of Air Jordans that someone rents to look popular or look impressive. However, if the shoes are granted to be sold, so the same Air Jordans, you sell to pay your rent because they're so absurdly expensive, or at least they were when I was a kid. Profit from this type of loan is usury. And the same is just as true of money. When granted to be used in exchange, which is a use that consumes the money in the relevant sense, taking a profit is usury. But if money is granted as security on some debt, and here I'll note that the money granted is formally granted as money, because it's granted not as these coins or this metal, but as something capable of satisfying the debt. Then it may be rented, when granted as security, for a profit, since such a use does not consume the money. Hence, the good, or its nature, is indifferent to the use we make of it. It's not morally relevant. Rather, it is the manner in which it is granted, namely what sort of contract is involved, that determines whether exacting profit is usury or perhaps licit rental income. Now, given this fundamental premise, if briefly and incompletely established, we need to properly distinguish different sorts of contracts. And this brings me to another facet of the controversy, which I wish to focus on here, namely the conflating of the proper object of usury, the so-called mutuum contract, with commercial exchanges such as sales. The mutuum comes to us from Roman law and may be defined briefly as the grant of some good to be restored later in kind, for which the borrower is personally liable. I'll explain more about the mutuum later. However, the issue at hand is treating the mutuum as some sort of exchange. Now, some authors explicitly call the mutuum a sale with a mere difference in time. In a sale, there is an intra-temporal exchange where we give and receive immediately, whereas in the mutuum, there is an inter-temporal exchange where the giving and receiving occurs at different times. Now, the issue with this is that it reduces usury merely to a species of just price, where the interest becomes just a component of the exchange rate of the same good at different times, or so such authors would argue. Now, to disambiguate the mutuum from exchanges, I'll argue that the difference resides in the manner in which justice is established in each. And really this goes to the nature of the contract and how it differs essentially. So let us then turn first to the case of a simple sale as the paradigmatic case of an exchange. In the simple sale, the shoemaker exchanges shoes for food with the farmer. This sort of exchange arises from the fact that we're not always capable of obtaining what we need by ourselves. Moreover, if we had no need of something, we would not engage in exchange, and for this reason, as Aristotle notes, a doctor rarely exchanges with other doctors, because he already has the goods and skills a doctor has, but often with a farmer or a grocer, because while he may have medicine, he may not have food. What this entails is that exchange involves goods that are diverse in kind. However, for the question of justice, we must ask something like, how many shoes is a house? The question arises principally because the goods are different in kind and so rarely share any common qualities to commensurate them. To answer this question, there is a measure. We need a measure to bring these things into a sort of equality, and this we make use of as need or value. Now, this measure is embodied in an object used as money, which is used to measure all things offered in exchange and is itself something exchanged. This involves a sort of reciprocative justice, as the equality is established in the giving and receiving here and now. So I give you as much as you give me, but difference in kind. And so it's more of this justice in these exchanges of diverse goods is determined by the application of a measure extrinsic to the goods. Now, juxtaposed to the sale, let's consider the Roman law contract of comodatum. While the name may be unfamiliar, the concept of this transaction is well known. For example, consider the ordinary case of a library loan, which is really just a sort of comodatum. In this transaction, the borrower receives the book from the lender or library, including a right to make use of it for free. At the end of the loan term, the borrower must restore the very same book granted, and this act satisfies the debt. This restoration is an act of restitution, according to Aquinas. While the primary sense of restitution is restoring a loss inflicted unjustly, Aquinas admits restitution, at least analogically, in the library loan. By granting the book, there enters a sort of inequality when the lender grants the book. because the book that belongs to the library is now possessed by another. So the library does not have what is its own. There's an inequality in possession. And so this is not an unjust inequality because the lender grants it freely and the contract is ordered to its restoration, unlike the thief whose theft has no such ordination. Hence, when the book is returned, this inequality is rectified and the contract is satisfied. Now, unlike the sale, in the library loan, justice is satisfied through returning the thing identically. And it's through this act of restitution rather than this immediate act of giving and receiving. So there's no inequality involved in the sale. Hence, whereas in the sale there's an equality of value as an extrinsic measure, here there's an equality in being. What was received is exactly what is returned. Now let us consider another, perhaps equally obscurely named contract, but no less familiar, the locatio, which may be a lease or rental of a good. Here we might compare this to the comodatum as a textbook rental to a library loan. Now in both cases the book is granted with the right to use it, but whereas the library loan is granted freely, the textbook rental comes with a price. In either case, there is still this active restoration of the book at the end of the loan term, but this only partially satisfies the lease. In addition, in the lease, there is the price paid for the use. Now, in the lease, as in the library loan, the use is granted, but since the good must be restored identically, this right is limited. The leasee can only use the good in such a way so as not to substantially alter nor consume or alienate the book. The borrower can read it, but he can't tear out pages. He can't burn it or sell it. This is because in the lease, the leaser retains ownership of the book. For to alter or alienate the book is proper to ownership as disposing of the being of the thing and not merely the use. What this means is that when the leaser grants the book, he grants possession of it, and possession is restored to him. However, the use or right to use is something apart or separable from this. This right to use then enters into a sort of exchange, which is logically distinct, though essentially united to the act of restoration, formally constituting the nature of the lease. It is this separability of the use from the ownership, and these are particular uses, so not any use whatsoever, and consequently what is restored that forms the basis of the price and profit the leaser receives. So because the use is something apart from what is restored, because what is restored identically, the use can enter into an exchange. And consequently, the act of restitution returns the leaser to equality in his possession and is not a principle of profit. He receives back just what is his, whereas the exchange of use is what provides that profit. So with this, we can return to the case of the mutuum. Now, similar to the comodatum, the mutuum is a sort of loan to be returned later. However, unlike the comodatum, the mutuum grants full ownership to the borrower. Now, this is because the borrower may make use of the good such that he alienates it. That is, he disposes or loses possession of it. If he eats a sandwich or sells a pair of shoes, in both cases the things are lost to him. Now, unlike the library loan, he may sell or destroy the good, and consequently, he must restore it in kind, come what may. So he takes the full ownership and the concomitant risk of it with him. Now, this restoration is necessarily in kind because having alienated the good, he can only restore the same sort of thing. Hence, whereas in the library loan there is an equality in being, in the mutuum there is an equality in kind or use, as still an intrinsic measure of equality. This is the sense in which the mutuum is sometimes called a loan of fungibles, because fungibility simply means interchangeable in use. Now, for example, consider you may lend some pine firewood for the evening, and if I return to you some birch firewood, which is just as good, then there is a sort of equality of use as firewood. On the other hand, if you lend me some maple boards so I can finish a woodworking project, I could not return to you pine or poplar, as the species of wood makes a great deal of difference in their use in woodworking. So there's a distinction in materially the goods may be different under some consideration, but formally they're both firewood, and so they're formally capable of the same use, because that's how we name them. So we name it firewood because it's used for creating a fire. And so in woodworking, that material aspect of it really does enter into the formal consideration of what it is and what it's used for, because it does make such a big difference in the woodworking. I'm a woodworker, if you hadn't guessed. We may now then turn to the question of profit. Now, as we saw with the book examples, the restoration was not the source of profit. In receiving back the book, the library or leaser is restored to what was his own exactly. The profit in the lease arose from the use which stood apart from that which was restored. However, in the case of the mutuum, the full ownership passes and is restored. Consequently, there is nothing apart from the ownership for which the lender can exchange for a price. So with respect to the contract and its the object of the contract, considered as the thing that's lent, there's nothing apart from the thing lent which the lender can charge for. Moreover, we may also note that in the library loan or the lease, if the value of the good changes over the term of the contract, the borrower does not owe more or less, but rather restoration of what was received. And the same is true in the case of the mutuum. I wish I had kind of left this part out because it's a rather subtle point, and I didn't spend enough time with it. But it's noting the issue with inflation, for example, because some people who still wish to defend the traditional doctrine of usury will still cite inflation. And so the value of money goes down, so you have to restore at least as much money in return. And so my response to that, looking at the nature of these contracts, would be to say, something along the lines of like, okay, well, I borrow a textbook from the library for 6 months to a year, something like that, and during that period, let's say, the author or publisher comes out with a new edition of that book. So consequently, the value of that book has decreased. And that's just typical with a new edition of a book, especially when it's more expanded. And so the value of it decreases. But no one argues that when you return the library loan, or when you turn the book you rented, that somehow you owe something more because of that decrease in value, even if it was known to both lender and borrower ahead of time. Like you wouldn't charge more merely because of that, and especially in the library loan, because you're restoring them back to what is their own, and so you're not restoring them back to the same value. You're restoring them to what is their own, the object, and so this is something I want to expand on in the fuller essay, but it really goes to the point that I'm reading more about in Thomistic juridical realism, that the use, IUS, or right, is really grounded in the thing. And so in that sense, it's not the value that you're restoring, it's the thing. The value is something that stands apart from the thing. And so that's principally what you're supposed to restore. Now, in the case of a theft where the good is, used up or alienated or gone, you can restore value, but it's the value of what you would have restored. And so that's why Aquinas admits, I think, in Article 2 on the question on usury, that like you can repay the usury with other things than in kind, but you have to first recognize that the normal conditions of the mutual is to restore the very same thing, and that it's only through a kind of stipulation that you would restore value through something else. And so yeah, that's something I need to expand on, but that's a further point than what we're trying to establish here. Anyway, to continue with the essay. So from this we can draw some categorical distinctions between the mutuum and the commercial exchange, such as sales. And here I'm going to work a little bit more detailed in focusing on Aquinas' action theory to really draw this out more clearly than here. But first is that the mutuum involves an act of restitution or rectifying justice that restores some inequality, whereas exchange involves a simultaneous giving and receiving in an act of reciprocative justice. Second, as a result of this difference, there is a difference in how equality is determined. In the mutuum, justice is established by the restoration of a good, but the restoration is determined by equality in the use of what was given. This is a measure intrinsic to the thing, as it references its qualities and nature. In contrast, exchanges need to involve an extrinsic measure, since they differ in kind and so lack a measure intrinsic to the nature of the good exchanged. This extrinsic measure may differ according to time and place, and so a trader may buy and sell for a profit, but the nature of the good lent in one place or time remains the same, and so whatever is given, wherever or whenever that happens to be, is what needs to be restored, wherever or whenever that happens to be. Now, to make this more concrete, to a modern economy, I want to consider a modern debt that is sometimes thought to be usurious, namely a savings account at a bank. And so in this case, we're talking about the savings account with respect to the depositor who receives interest would be the usurer in this scenario. So I'd like to first introduce the distinction between money at the bank and money in the bank. Now, what I mean by this is there's a difference between money placed in a safety deposit box as opposed to a savings account. Money in a safety deposit box is held and preserved by the bank and restored identically by the bank. The money remains the depositor's and is returned through an act of restitution. In contrast, money granted in a savings account is taken by the bank and spent on its operations. What happens here is another sort of exchange. In depositing the money, I'm exchanging my money for a claim against the assets of the bank. Financially, the money granted enters into the balance sheet of the bank as an asset, but my claim becomes a liability. That is something that is a debt that is due to me, a debt that they owe me. So this claim is partially constituted by my right to demand withdrawals, and these withdrawals are secured by the assets of the company. So ignoring FDIC insurance, if the bank runs out of money or assets to sell, I've lost my deposit. Hence, in a savings account, you are not loaning money to a bank in a mutuum. You're purchasing a claim against their assets, and the reception of some interest is a sort of rental income. And there is precedence for looking at it this way. In the Roman law contract of fiducia, which is sometimes characterized as a conditional sale, where the debtor retains some claim, but also the medieval census contract on some sort of farm, where the debtor, the farmer, pays some bits of the fruits of the land to the purchaser, the lender. And so, indeed, some people actually call the census a fiducia, which I found quite interesting. So there's some precedence for reading this way and seeing it more broadly in the economy. Consequently, if we examine the nature of contracts and how they establish various claims or rights, we can determine where usury is and is not present. Moreover, we can clearly distinguish between usurious loans from commercial exchanges for a profit. This firmly establishes usury as a kind of sin distinct from cheating or unjust prices. Now, with this in hand, we can begin restoring that cathedral of the Summa, especially with respect to usury, as well as commutative justice, and ultimately use, ius, or right, as the object of justice. So that is the presentation, and I'm going to be writing a fuller essay on it where I clarify and expand a couple of points that I mentioned already. So, but yeah, already at 35 minutes. So, thank you for listening. Hope you have a good day. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode.